Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the brand new, just announced Sigma 28-70mm F2.8 DG DN lens. Now this lens is going to be coming in both a Sony FE or full frame E mount, which I'm reviewing here, and then also in a Leica L mount. This lens, of course, is a little bit of a surprise to me in that it certainly doesn't seem to be a lens of the greatest need, perhaps. And when I look at the lineup, and of course Sigma has been incredibly prolific over the last about 2 years, and in less than that period of time, really, they have released 12 brand new designs for Sony E or Sony FE and then Leica L. And so during that time frame, I don't think that anyone has produced more lenses for them than them for this platform. But out of, that growing catalog of lenses, there still are some pretty significant holes, I think, that many of us would point at. I think that a lot of you are very interested in a 50mm f1.4 DN, in the same vein as the 85mm f1.4 we saw last year. And I think above all, people are looking for the 70 to 200mm f2.8 DN lens, which already we've gotten the 14 to 24mm, we've gotten the 24 to 70mm, and so it seems like that is the logical completion of the full frame Trinity zoom f2.8 zooms that are used by a lot of different professionals. But instead we got a second lens, covering the same focal length, and so this only goes to 28mm rather than 24mm. And, it is cheaper, not hugely cheaper as we're going to see, and it certainly is much more compact. And I think maybe that's more where maybe the logic lies. In many ways, this I think is going to be Sigma's more direct answer to the extraordinarily popular Tamron 28 to 75mm f2.8 RXD, a lens that to this point has been the best-selling lens in the world since its release. So understandably, Sigma probably wants a piece of that action. And so they have, kind of followed that same philosophy and have made a smaller yet standard zoom, which again is where I think the greatest asset is there. Now today we're going to be doing our definitive review where we jump into everything in great detail. If you want a quicker overview type review, check out my standard review instead. Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist, modern wallet that sets you free from a bulky traditional wallet while also making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. Visit phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber. You can even customize your wallet with new accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even the Chipolo tracking integration if you're the kind of person who loses their wallet. Use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out. So we're going to start by taking a look at the build and the handling, the design of this lens, and look at what's here, what's not here. Let's jump in and let's take a close look. So the first thing that stands out, I would say, is how compact this lens is. And so if you compare it to the Tamron 28 to 75, which the Tamron is going to be its most logical competitor, you can see that it is significantly shorter in overall length compared to the Tamron. The Sigma comes in at 103.5 millimeters, right over 4 inches, whereas the Tamron is 117.8 millimeters, 4.64 inches. And so it is about 14 millimeters longer, which obviously is significant. So depending on your carrying solution, it might actually be a difference maker for you. It might be that this lens attached to your camera fits into a small carrying solution, whereas the Tamron does not. But obviously, in many ways, I think one of the strongest aspects of this design from Sigma is how compact it is. Now, the diameter is pretty much identical, 72.3 millimeters for the Sigma, 73 millimeters for the Tamron, and so you're talking less than a millimeter difference. Both of them have a 67 millimeter front filter thread, but the shorter length of the Sigma does result in a lighter overall weight. It weighs in at 470 grams versus 550 grams for the Tamron. And so, while both of them are lightweight for a standard f2.8 zoom, obviously the Sigma is lighter still. That's really significant in terms of weight when you compare it to the Sigma 24-70 F2.8, which weighs in at 835 grams. And so it's a good, I think it's around 73% heavier than what this lens is. And so again, if small and light is your priority, this lens is going to fit the bill very well. Now, when it comes to the build, I'll say this, the Sigma actually feels a little bit better in hand in terms of, as far as the feel of the build quality. As you can see, the ribbing on the rings is a little bit deeper. I like the feel of the texture of the material a little bit better. But compared to the 24-70 Sigma and to the Tamron, you're missing a more complete weather sealing. What you have is just a thin gasket here at the lens mount, but no other internal seals, whereas the Tamron has about 6 internal seals and a fluorine coating up front. The Sigma does come with the lens hood, and I do prefer Sigma's lens hood, say, to this Tamron. The Tamron is just a really fairly basic piece of plastic. The Sigma here has some texture variation, and of course I do like that ribbed ring that does help to give you a natural, kind of texture point for mounting the actual lens hood. Now in this case, there is no locking mechanism on the hood. It's not needed, however. It bayonets on there really nice, tight, and precise. And so it actually takes quite a bit of force to break it loose. So you're not going to have any problem with it inadvertently coming loose on you. Compared to the 24-70, you are losing out on a few features. This has only an AF/MF switch, and it comes under the Contemporary brand as opposed to the Art brand. So it has a little bit less there. So you're missing the focus hold button. There is no zoom lock button. However, I've seen no evidence of zoom creep at all here. It's really nicely damped and, only extends about 3 centimeters. So I don't think it'd be that big of a deal anyway. But the compact nature of the lens and the fact that the zoom ring is back here means that it's unlikely you're going to be inadvertently bumping it anyway if you're carrying it like on a strap. And so I don't think you'll actually have a real-world problem with it. So I don't think that that was actually needed. As noted, the overall zoom action here is really nice and smooth. Like that a lot. Likewise, the manual focus action is good. I think Sigma's doing a good job of focus emulation recently with these lenses. I say emulation because it is focused by wire. There's no direct coupling, and so all the focus is actually done by the motor inside it. There are 9 rounded aperture blades, and that's a little bit lower blade count than what you see on the 24-70, which has 11 blades. However, it does do a nice job of keeping a circular aperture shape, as you can see here, even when the lens is stopped down. Now, like the Tamron, this lens sports 2 different minimum focus distances and thus 2 different magnification values. And so at 28 millimeters, you can focus as closely as 0.19 centimeters, or meters, I should say, so 19 centimeters. So as you can see, you're probably going to want to remove the lens hood if you're trying to get that close. You have to get really, really close to your subject to achieve that. And so, just as you can see here, it's not always all that practical. And you will get a 0.30 times magnification there, if you can access that. Then at 70 millimeters, minimum focus distance is 38 centimeters. And that's shared with the Tamron, but the Tamron does have an extra 5 millimeters of focal length, and so it gives you a little bit higher 0.25 times magnification there. I estimate the Sigma's performance at more like 0.22 or 0.23 times, somewhere in that range. At the end of the day, I think the biggest advantage of this particular lens is the compact size. I mean, you're talking about a full-frame standard zoom that pretty much fits in your hand. And so I think that's going to be one of the great selling features for those of you that want to travel small and light but still want the flexibility of a standard zoom. So I think, again, the big takeaway here is that they've really exceeded in making a nicely compact lens. There's, some things that are missing versus the 24-70 millimeter, and I think the most notable thing that's missing is going as wide as 24 millimeters, but a few features that we don't see there. And it is at a little bit of a disadvantage compared to the Tamron in that while the perceptive build feels a little bit nicer, it doesn't have as many professional grade features, most notably when it comes to the weather sealing. So that's probably the greatest disadvantage. Now, when it comes to the autofocus performance, Sigma has employed an STM, or a stepping focus motor here, and I would say pretty much universally, Sigma's stepping motors have been very, very good on Sony. Where I've tested them, I don't shoot Leica, and so I've tested them on Sony, and they have been, roundly excellent. That's true here as well. We've got a very fast focusing speed. We've got a very quiet focusing performance, and in my experience, it has been very accurate. I had only one situation to where it basically, that kind of stood out to me, where it really refused to focus on a closer focus subject, as you can see here, and so it stayed stuck on the background despite my best efforts, and eventually I manually focused it to where I wanted to get this shot here, but fortunately that was the exception rather than the rule. These days, you hardly need to talk, at least on Sony and Canon, hardly need to talk about IAF accuracy, because it's pretty much flawless in my experience these days. There's very few misses, and that was true here. Whether it was a human or an animal subject, I got consistently good tracking of the eye and good IAF performance. Likewise, the lens worked fine for me when I shot a devotion episode for my church using the lens. It stayed locked on my face, didn't hunt around, and it did a good job as a part of that. It also, as you're going to see here, is able to do quick, accurate, smooth focus pulls as well. Let's take a quick look at that. So as you can see, nothing to complain about at all there, and that's been my experience recently. Sigma's doing a really good job with the focus systems on these lenses, and of course that is it's a great relief. I never complain about Sigma focus anymore, and it seemed like going back a little bit further back with their DSLR lenses until kind of the last year or two of DSLR releases. It seemed like I was always complaining about some aspect of Sigma focus. That's just no longer an issue anymore. So kudos to Sigma for really learning that lesson and nailing things on that front. Now, there is no image stabilization built into the lens itself. That's true of all of its competitors as well, so I'm certainly not going to dock it for that. You're going to be relying on your in-camera image stabilization. My experience is it works just fine. You've got a relatively fast maximum aperture, and you've got, that in-body image stabilization. It does the trick, and I doubt that there's a lot that people will be missing on that front. So why don't we talk more specifically about the image quality, and I will throw in some comparisons to the Tamron here, because I think that at the end of the day, that's going to be the two lenses that people are most weighing in terms of comparison points. They're very similar in price. And so let's jump in and let's take a look at the image quality together. So first of all, here is a look at this zoom range. So you can go from 28 millimeters to 70 millimeters, and that shows you the difference in your zoom as a part of that. So while this does have a little more abbreviated zoom range than some competing lenses, it still obviously is going to be very useful. So taking a look at vignette and distortion here, I'm going to cycle that off so you can see this for a moment. Well, you can see, taking a look at the left, which is the 28 millimeter, 28-70 millimeter, as you can see that there is unfortunately a not completely linear barrel distortion, and so you can see there's a little bit of dip in here. It bulges out and then dips back, which does make it a little bit harder to correct. Now, comparing it to the 24-70 millimeter, you can see that the amount of distortion, not only does it have that more complex kind of mustache pattern on the 24-70, but as you can see, it's definitely much more pronounced. So about a plus 24 if you try to correct it here versus about a plus 12 or 13 on the left. And so, certainly there's less distortion at 28 millimeters versus 24 millimeters, but it remains a somewhat complex pattern. So that complexity does make for a little bit more difficult manual correction, and so you can see after trying to correct that you don't end up with straight lines because of that, it's non-linear distortion pattern. Obviously, you're going to get a better result with a standard profile, but for RAW files, that doesn't exist yet. You will get it with JPEGs and video in camera. You can also note here that there is a significant amount of vignette in the corners. I had to use a plus 95 and pull the midpoint all the way over to try to to correct for it. You can see that it's still not completely even. And so, we're talking about somewhere between 3.5 and 4 stops of vignette in the corners in particular, which is obviously really heavy. This is one area where the Tamron definitely wins in that you can see that there is a lot less distortion. It's much more linear in fashion, so it's easier to correct for, and there's significantly less vignette, about 1.5 stops less vignette in the corners, and so, a better performance at 28 millimeters when it comes to these metrics. Now at 70 millimeter-ish, sometimes it didn't quite get there, but you can see that there is the distortion is changed to a pincushion type distortion. Fortunately, this is a nice linear distortion, and so you can see I had no problem manually correcting for it. Vignette is less heavy. It's basically the equivalent of what the Tamron is at 28 millimeters, and so I would say somewhere between 2 and 2.5 stops, and pretty easy to correct for. So at 28 millimeters wide open, obviously that vignette is heavy enough that it's going to be very noticeable either in the sky or particularly in a lightly colored foreground like this snow. And so you can see that just eliminating the vignette manually does pretty radically transform the look of the image. And so some cases you might have a rare occasion where this is desirable, probably not many. But, obviously you're going to want to correct for it in most cases to get a more even illumination in the frame. So as you can see here, taking a look at the chart at 28 millimeters, we can see that, jumping in, we have got fairly good contrast and good detail center of the frame. Mid-frame looks really strong. It's holding up very well. And down into the corner, the result also looks quite good. Now, if we compare to the Tamron, we see that the Tamron is producing a little bit more resolution and a little bit stronger contrast. And you can see, for example, that the moire pattern here is more defined, which shows that, it's resolving a little stronger. In the center of the frame, there's not a significant difference. I think the contrast is starting to tilt towards Sigma's favor, but if you pop down into the corner, the Sigma definitely looks stronger in the corner. And that tends to be the pattern that we see throughout the zoom range, is that the Tamron has the advantage in the middle, but the further you move out on the periphery, the more that the Sigma's advantage grows. Now at 28 millimeters, all it takes is a stop down to f4 for your contrast and detail levels to come up to excellent levels. And so as you can see, we've got really strong performance there. Stopping on down to f5.6 continues to improve those contrast levels and allows the textures to show up even better, as we can see. If we compare the Sigma to the Tamron once again, we find that both of them look excellent in the center of the frame, with the Tamron having a bit of a contrast advantage. In the mid-frame, both of them continue to look excellent. I don't know that I would call either one a winner there. But down in the corner, once again, I do think that the Sigma retains an advantage even at f5.6. Now, minimum aperture here is f22, and on a higher resolution body like the 42 megapixel A7R III that I'm using for these tests, I typically don't recommend shooting near minimum aperture, and as you can see, it's softer and has less contrast at f22 than even at f2.8, and that's due to the diffraction that comes from the higher resolution and the pixel density of the camera. Moving on to 35 millimeters, 35 and 50 millimeters are actually really similar in performance. And so you see a very good center of the frame performance that improves in terms of contrast at f4 pretty significantly in the center of the frame. We see a mid-frame performance that is good to start with and gets even better with a mild stop down to f4. And down in the corners aren't quite as strong as at 28 millimeters, but we can see stopping down to f4 is enough to really start to improve things. Stopping on down to f5.6 or f8 makes them stronger still. So arriving at the end of the focal range at 70 millimeters, the first thing I want to do is just give you a quick comparison to the Tamron here, just in terms of the framing. And so you can see that the 75 millimeters of the Tamron does frame significantly tighter, and so you can see areas where the image is clipping off here because of that additional 5 millimeters. So taking a look at resolution and contrast, we see at f2.8 f2.8 in particular, that things are a little bit softer and lower contrast at 70 millimeters versus the other places in the range that we have seen. Stopping down to f4 in the center does significantly improve contrast and allow more detail to be shown. Mid-frame is also weaker, but it does start to improve at f4, though not to the degree that we saw earlier in the zoom range. And if we look down into the corner, we can see that the corners are significantly softer than what they were at earlier points, even at f4. Stopping down to f5.6 improves things, though not to the level we saw even at f4 at other parts in the zoom range. You need to stop on down to f8 to start to approach, kind of maximum corner performance here. And even then, it doesn't ever achieve quite the same level as what we saw earlier on in the zoom range, though at this point it is, very competent. Now, if we compare to the Tamron, once again, 70 versus 75 millimeters, the Tamron continues to show a little bit better contrast and performance in the center of the frame. However, even by the mid-frame, there's an obvious advantage for Sigma here, and that advantage continues on into the corners, though it's not as pronounced because the Sigma is weaker in the corners than what it is at other points, or at least at 70 millimeters, than it is at other points in the zoom range, as we've seen. With both lenses stopped down to f5.6, we see that the mid-frame still slightly favors Sigma, though it's not as significant at this point. And down in the corner, I think the same is true, though it's, there's neither one of them looks exceptional. There's some give and take, I would say, in both when it comes to the corner performance. Now, both the Tamron and the Sigma, Tamron on the right, Sigma on the left, have very strong magnification levels at minimum focus at the wide end, 28 millimeters, but you can see that the Tamron has a significantly higher amount of magnification, 0.34 versus 0.30 times. You can also see that the Tamron definitely performs better up close with much better contrast and thus detail rendering here up close. The same proves true at 70 versus 75 millimeters, where the Tamron has noticeably higher levels of magnification, and as you can see, even at a global level, it is rendering details with better contrast, and just mostly contrast is more significant. And you can see as we zoom in to a pixel level that it's a significant improvement with the Tamron over the Sigma here. So here's a real world 28 millimeter, close to minimum focus. You can see that, on the narrow plane of focus, detail and contrast is pretty good, not exceptional, but I mean, obviously that's a very high degree of magnification. And then at 70 millimeters, this is a kind of a tough scene, these waxy leaves with, bright window light on them. But in this particular one, contrast is only okay at 70 millimeters under these circumstances. Here's another shot that shows how shallow a depth of field you can get at 70 millimeters, but we can see looking in at a pixel level that the detail and the contrast is okay at best here, though the bokeh looks really, really smooth and creamy. Now, a quick look at that bokeh, we can see that there is a little bit of fringing around the bokeh circles, a little bit of just generalized busyness in there, but nothing like an onion bokeh, anything that's really distracting. And then as we stop down here at f4, we can see geometry starting to look really good. And then on at f5.6, you see a little bit of the aperture shape, but the general impression here is still nice and round. So the quality of the background blur, the bokeh in real-world scenes, in many ways is going to depend upon the shooting situation. Here, fairly close to the subject, I think that the background looks quite nice. And here, I think it looks really nice. And so obviously, if you can get a ratio where the background is further away, you can get close to your subject, you can produce really nice, creamy bokeh. In this case also, I think good. There's a fair enough distance to the background where everything is handled nicely, and a little bit further away like this, I think that contrast and detail holds up a little bit better. In this situation, the ratio isn't as favorable, and you can see that the background is closer. And in this case, I think it looks a little bit busier and more distracting. However, this is not bad for a standard zoom. I think in many situations they're okay, but they're not, as exceptional as, say, an 85mm f1.4, even if you're shooting at 70 millimeters, obviously. Flare resistance is generally quite good. You can see basically no ghosting type artifacts, marring the image, even in bright early morning sun. A little bit of a localized kind of veiling effect at the epicenter of the sun. Stop down, things still continue to look really good. Now, if I zoom in a bit, we can see that at f2.8, there's a little bit more of this kind of prismatic kind of veiling effect here, zoomed in. But as we stop down, the flare resistance, instead of getting worse, actually gets better. Here's a couple of more images, just kind of real-world images. And so this, you can see a little bit of that, kind of veiling effect here and prismatic coloring, but I don't think it's destructive to the image. And here, this looks really fantastic, kind of middle of the zoom range. And obviously, it's highly resistant to flare in this particular shot. And we can see too, if we pan across the sun wide open here, there's very little ghosting artifacts, contrast holds up. And then if we stop down, we see a similar truth with just a hint more of ghosting artifacts in a few positions, but overall, really nicely done. So overall takeaways from that is that whether the Tamron or the Sigma is the better performance really is going to depend on what your shooting priorities are. And throughout the range, I found fairly consistently that the Tamron was a bit better in the center of the frame, with the Sigma consistently better at the periphery of the frame. And so if you're someone that values a corner sharpness, depending on how you're shooting, then the Sigma's performance is a little bit better. If you're someone who prioritizes center performance, then the Tamron's performance is a little bit better. There's give and take across the board. Tamron does have a little bit less distortion, a little bit less vignette, but at the same time, there's nothing out of hand here, and certainly less on the distortion front on the 28-70 than what we saw on the Sigma 24-70mm, which had really strong barrel distortion at 24mm. So at the end of the day, I think that we have got a good optical performance here, which is more significant when you consider how compact the lens is. This is a lens that is going to be fairly competitive with the Sony 24-70mm f2.8 G Master lens, howbeit at a much lower price point and much smaller form factor. And I think that for many people is going to be a great selling point for them. And so whether or not this lens is a worthy consideration over the 24-70mm f2.8 DN, if your budget is really tight, obviously you got some savings here, but I would say the bigger reason to consider this lens over the existing 24-70 is more if you are greatly concerned about size, because the 24-70mm is already a very competitively priced lens, and in the US market it's only $200 more, and that's giving you better build quality, it's giving you the extra 4mm of width, a few extra features, so there's definitely $200 worth of additional features there, I would say. But what really sets this lens apart is the fact that you've got a very competent standard zoom that is well under 500 grams in weight and incredibly compact in terms of length. And so if you're shooting with one of the new compact bodies like say a Sony A7C, this is a natural fit there. And of course I think it also makes a lot of sense on the Leica front as well if you're a Leica shooter. So at the end of the day, I do think that this is a good and a competent lens. We'll have to see how the market bears out whether this is a lens that the market was actually looking for. And maybe it is, and I certainly applaud Sigma for exploring with a lot of their recent lenses a complementary line that is smaller, compact, lighter compared to their larger art series type offerings. And so I think that they're learning that there are different photographers out there, and there's a couple of different markets within the overall market of photographers, and if they learn to tap into both of those, they've just broaden their success rate. And so kudos to Sigma on that front. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you'll take a look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review, also linkage to an image gallery so you can check out more photos. Beyond that, there are also buying links, though again with a lens that is just being announced. Some of those links are going to take a little while to populate, and where you can actually see content and purchase or pre-order the lens. And I understand that it's going to start shipping somewhere in mid-March. And so keep an eye out for that, obviously. You can also find linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron, sign up for my newsletter that comes out every Thursday. There's linkage there to purchase my merch if you want to get some Let the Light In gear. And beyond that, of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Be sure to click that notification bell so you'll be notified when new content drops. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.